Emily had always loved the outdoors. When she inherited an old cabin deep in the woods from her estranged uncle, she saw it as the perfect escape from her hectic city life. She packed up her car and drove out to Cedar Cabin, eager for a weekend of tranquility in solitude. The cabin was charming in a rustic way, nestled among towering pines and blanketed by a canopy of leaves that let only slivers of sunlight through. The first night was peaceful. Emily fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the gentle rustling of the forest. On the second night, as Emily was reading by the fireplace, she heard a faint tapping at the window. She dismissed it as a branch or an animal and went to bed. But the tapping persisted, growing louder and more insistent. When she finally got up to investigate, there was nothing outside, only the dark, impenetrable forest. The third night, Emily was woken by a chilling breeze. The front door was wide open. She knew she had locked it. Panic surged through her as she checked every room, but there was no sign of an intruder. She bolted the door and tried to calm herself, but sleep wouldn't come. The following day, she found strange symbols carved into the trees around the cabin. They seemed ancient, almost otherworldly. Fear gnawed at her, but she convinced herself it was the work of local teenagers playing a prank. As dusk fell, the atmosphere grew oppressive. Emily decided to leave the next morning. That night, the cabin seemed alive with noises, whispers, footsteps, and the incessant tapping at the window. She huddled under the covers, praying for dawn. In the dead of night, the whispers grew louder, forming words she could almost understand. Her heart pounded as she realized they were calling her name. The temperature plummeted, and she felt an icy hand brush against her cheek. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Morning came, and Emily packed her belongings in a frenzy. As she hurried to her car, she saw a figure standing in the shadows of the forest, tall, gaunt, and watching her with hollow eyes. She didn't look back as she sped away from Cedar Cabin, vowing never to return. Years later, Emily learned that her uncle had bought the cabin from a man who claimed it was cursed. The previous owners had all met tragic ends. The cabin was now abandoned, left to the ghosts of the past. Emily never spoke of her experience, but she often dreamed of the cabin and the figure in the woods, wondering what would have happened if she had stayed one more night. Jason had always been a skeptic. When his friends dared him to spend a weekend alone at the infamous Blackwood cabin, he couldn't resist the challenge. The cabin had a dark reputation. Locals whispered about disappearances, strange lights, and unsettling sounds emanating from the woods. Determined to prove his friends wrong, Jason packed his gear and hiked up Blackwood Trail. The cabin was old and decrepit, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It stood alone in a clearing, surrounded by dense, foreboding trees. As the sun set, Jason built a fire and settled in, confident that he would spend a quiet night. The first few hours were uneventful. Jason explored the cabin, finding nothing but dust and cobwebs. He laughed at the idea of ghosts and curses, feeling more relaxed as the night wore on. Around midnight, he heard the first strange sound, a low, mournful wail carried on the wind. He shrugged it off, attributing it to an animal. But the sounds didn't stop. The wail was soon joined by the creak of floorboards and the soft, rhythmic tapping of something against the walls. Jason's unease grew as the noises seemed to come closer. He armed himself with a flashlight and decided to investigate. As he stepped outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of whispers. The tapping became louder, more insistent, and Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He shone his flashlight around the clearing, but saw nothing. Back inside the cabin, Jason noticed something he hadn't before, a large, old mirror covered with a thick layer of dust. When he wiped it clean, his reflection looked back at him, but there was something off. The eyes in the mirror seemed darker, more hollow. He felt a sudden urge to turn away, but his reflection didn't move. It just stared, unblinking. Terrified, Jason backed away and tripped over an old rug. As he hit the floor, he noticed a trapdoor hidden beneath it. Summoning his courage, he opened the trapdoor and descended into a dark, musty cellar. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and he could barely see in the dim light of his flashlight. At the far end of the cellar, Jason found a small, crude altar. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, and the remains of burnt candles surrounded it. In the center of the altar lay an old, leather-bound book. He opened it, revealing page after page of cryptic incantations and sketches of monstrous beings. A sudden noise from above made him jump. The trapdoor had slammed shut on its own. Jason's heart raced as he scrambled up the stairs, only to find the door locked. He pounded on it, shouting for help, but the only response was the echo of his own voice. Desperate, Jason returned to the altar. As he examined the book more closely, he realized that the symbols matched those he had seen around the cabin. A chilling thought crossed his mind: the cabin wasn't just haunted, it was a gateway, a place where dark rituals had summoned something terrible. The whispers grew louder, forming words he couldn't understand. Shadows moved in the corners of the cellar, growing bolder and more defined. Jason felt a cold, unnatural presence closing in on him. He grabbed the book and began to recite one of the incantations, hoping to banish whatever he had awakened. The air grew thick and oppressive, and Jason's voice faltered. The shadows converged, and he felt a hand, cold as death, close around his throat. He struggled, but his strength ebbed away. The last thing he saw was his reflection in the mirror above the altar, eyes wide with fear, mouth open in a silent scream. Days later, Jason's friends found the cabin empty. The book was gone, the altar undisturbed. They never spoke of Blackwood Cabin again, but the locals knew the truth. Another skeptic had fallen victim to the curse, and the cabin on Blackwood Trail remained a place of darkness and fear. Deep in the heart of the Whispering Pines forest, nestled beside a once clear stream, stood the old Willow Creek cabin. For decades, it had been abandoned, left to the elements and the creeping tendrils of nature. The local townsfolk whispered tales of its haunted past, a past shrouded in mystery and tragedy. In the late 1800s, the cabin had been built by Samuel Thornton, a reclusive man who sought solace in the woods after the untimely death of his wife and child. Samuel was a skilled carpenter, and his cabin was a testament to his craft. However, as beautiful as it was, the cabin was also a place of sorrow. Samuel's grief turned to madness, and one cold winter night, he disappeared without a trace. The townsfolk who dared to venture near the cabin spoke of eerie sounds and ghostly apparitions. Years passed, and the cabin fell into disrepair. It was said that on stormy nights, the ghost of Samuel Thornton could be seen wandering the forest, his mournful cries echoing through the trees. The once clear stream turned murky, and the surrounding woods took on a sinister air. One autumn, a group of college friends decided to spend the weekend in the forest. They had heard the tales of Willow Creek Cabin but dismissed them as mere folklore. Seeking adventure and a good scare, they set out to find the infamous cabin. The group consisted of 5 friends: Emily, Mark, Sarah, Jake, and Lisa. They arrived at the forest's edge late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the trees. As they hiked deeper into the woods, an uneasy feeling settled over them. The path grew narrower, and the trees seemed to close in around them. As dusk approached, they finally caught sight of the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, its roof sagging and its windows dark and empty. Despite its dilapidated state, the cabin had an undeniable presence, as if it were watching them. They set up camp outside, building a fire to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. As the night wore on, they shared ghost stories, each one more chilling than the last. But when it came time to talk about Willow Creek Cabin, a hush fell over the group. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending shivers down their spines. Emily, the bravest of the group, suggested they explore the cabin. Armed with flashlights, they approached the weathered door. It creaked open with a groan, revealing a dust-covered interior. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. They split up, each taking a different part of the cabin. Mark and Sarah ventured into the kitchen, where they found old, rusted utensils and a broken table. Jake and Lisa explored the bedrooms, where tattered curtains billowed in the cold breeze. Emily made her way to the living room, where an old rocking chair sat ominously by the fireplace. As Emily approached the chair, she felt a sudden chill. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of her own breathing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned to call out to her friends, but the words caught in her throat. In the kitchen, Mark and Sarah heard the same whispering. They exchanged nervous glances, their bravado quickly fading. The temperature seemed to drop, and their breath came out in visible puffs. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. They pounded on the door, shouting for help, but their voices were swallowed by the darkness. Jake and Lisa fared no better. As they explored the second bedroom, they felt an oppressive presence. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick. A shadowy figure appeared at the foot of the bed, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Paralyzed with fear, they watched as the figure advanced toward them. Back in the living room, Emily saw the rocking chair begin to move on its own. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The whispers grew louder, forming unintelligible words. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder and turned to find herself face to face with the ghost of Samuel Thornton. His eyes were hollow, and his expression was one of endless sorrow. He reached out, and Emily felt a wave of grief wash over her. She stumbled backward, her mind filled with images of Samuel's lost family. The other friends heard her scream and rushed to her side, but they, too, were confronted by the spectral figure. In that moment, they understood the true horror of Willow Creek Cabin. Samuel Thornton's spirit was trapped, forever mourning his lost family. The friends fled the cabin, their terror driving them through the forest and back to the safety of their cars. They never spoke of that night again, each haunted by their own memories. The cabin remains in the forest, a silent sentinel to the tragedy that occurred. Those who venture too close on stormy nights can still hear the whispers of Samuel Thornton, a reminder of the sorrow that lingers in the shadows of Willow Creek Cabin.